to introduce Daniel Tutt, who is a member of our forum and a PhD candidate at the European Graduate School. He's studying philosophy there. And tonight he will speak to us on this topic, from the name to the names of the Father.
Thank you, Deborah. So the outline that you have in front of you has, I think, 5 sections. Yeah. We'll be lucky if we get to the late Lacan, to be honest with you, because I've packed in quite a lot. What's going on, guys?
He was asking for something from me. So.
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, so don't think of this in a linear sense. These sections are not linear. What I want to do is actually dive in at a point of Lacan's career in 1963, where we have what Jacques-Alain Miller has called the non-existent seminar, which was on the names of the Father but never published. And the reasons that it was never published are very, very vague indeed. From Lacan's own retelling, we have vague statements such as the ones quoted at the top of your outline. It's a secret. I won't tell you the truth of names of the Father because I'm not a part of university discourse. Now, by way of biography, everyone knows that in 1963, Lacan's French colleagues had banned him from the IPA. And Miller makes the interesting point that in 1963, this symbolic act of removing his name also led to Lacan's movement away from names of the Father as one of his central concepts. And this is something that's clear throughout the later work. Something we could say in French culture at the time was structuralism. You had Althusser, you had Lacan, you had many philosophers and thinkers adhering to Levi-Straussian structuralism. And the Father was sort of one of the key ideas in popular culture that Lacan was known for. Many of the students, for example, in the May '68 riots, which were very seminal to French culture at the time, took over his classroom. One of them wrote famously on the chalkboard, "Structures do not take to the streets." And people demanded to know, what is this idea of the Father? What is the name of the Father? Does it have to do with hierarchy? Does it have to do with repression? Why are you advocating it, in other words? And so he was very reluctant to this. He was very reluctant to present the concept in a coherent way. And so what I want to do tonight, and just to give you background as to what my interest in this concept is from political theory, many critics of psychoanalysis today and back then are very skeptical. They think that we can proceed in constructing notions of a social bond, in constructing notions of a community, without allegiance to or reliance upon what Lacan called the symbolic Father. And precisely because they think that the introduction of the signifier of the Father will somehow lead to greater repression, that it will lead to a certain totalizing idea, much of which is tied to what one critic of psychoanalysis calls a theological impulse, right? And so we'll get into that as well. So this is what interests me, because in my discovery, just to summarize, a crystallizing lesson I've learned about the name of the Father in psychoanalysis is precisely the idea that the Father is about the invention of a new desire. The Father is not about necessarily a forced repression of the subject. It is actually at the core of the core idea of a subject. It is the core idea of Lacan's revision of the Oedipus complex, the introduction of the symbolic Father, which we'll get into. So let me jump in with the idea of the name, nom du pere. Now, the nom is what is called in logic a proper name, and this comes from Frege's logic. And some interesting things to note about this idea of what a proper name is that a proper name is a pure signifier. Okay, so the father is what Lacan would call a pure signifier. You have in a pure signifier, for example, so a proper name would be something like Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, even though there is no property in existence today that is called Alexander the Great, we can still say that there was a world or a time in which Alexander the Great did indeed have what Lacan would call, or what logicians would call, extensional meaning. So there's two types. There's intentional, which is the definition of a concept. For example, the definition of psychoanalysis. And there's extensional meaning, which are psychoanalysts themselves and what they do and the concepts that they use to further their treatment. So this means that you can, the interesting thing about a proper name is that you can get rid of the properties that are associated with the proper name. Thus, the important point for our discussion is that the proper name is always a pure signifier, and it deletes all properties. This is why the proper name of the father is what Lacan calls empty, is an empty signifier. In Subversion of the Subject in the Dialectic of Desire, he says that the proper name has no other signification other than its utterance. Has no other signification other than its utterance. Now this is tied to the biblical definition that God gives of his own existence, which is purely its own utterance is justification enough. I am what I am. Now importantly, Lacan revises what St. Augustine says of God in the Bible. St. Augustine says, I am who I am. Lacan says, I am what I am. This implies that in the statement, God has obtained what Lacan would call his name of jouissance. That's the significant point. And has justified his own access to his own jouissance by uttering it in this such way. So any classification based on a proper name will in fact designate the subject as already being dead. So this is actually a very important point. This is why we speak of the father as a symbolic father as a dead father. So just like the subject itself that doesn't know whether it is alive or whether it is dead when it responds to the question, what am I? The response of the pure signifier would be, I am in the place of jouissance. And this is the same function as the father. At a later point, object A, object small a, is the proper name reduced to the pure matheme of A. So what we can get at with name of the father is something close to object A. Lacan points out in the non-existent seminar that Saint Anselm got close to name of the father when he refers to God as a something, a greater than which cannot be conceived. And what he means that there is a something in the something of God that is greater, that is a part of the real. Now, much of this actually leads to Lacan's core philosophical differentiation with Hegel. It's on this intersection between object A and name of the father. I'm not going to get into that. Instead, for the purpose of time, unless anyone has questions on this idea of the proper name of the father equals the pure signifier, I'm going to move from there to Oedipus. And it's going to be somewhat of a leap, but I think it will have some continuity. Okay? So to start with, Oedipus, of course, is a major concept. It's probably a bigger concept in Lacan than it was for Freud. As we know, Freud first talks about Oedipus in the interpretation of dreams. By Seminar 17, Lacan actually argues that Oedipus, for analysts, is unusable. Having to do with two factors. One, he argues that the myth itself was something that was a dream of Freud. Precisely prior to writing the interpretation of dreams, he had a fear of his own father's death, and so in other words, within the Freudian corpus, you could say perhaps that the Oedipus complex is overdetermined. So, but now at the same time, let's look at the core theoretical differences between Lacan and Freud on Oedipus. The main thing I want to point out is that for Lacan, Oedipus is purely within the imaginary. So much of the aggressiveness that is at the first stage of the Oedipus complex for which I know in my suggested reading I said read Seminar 4, but I'm going to be pulling mainly from Seminar 5. Are people familiar with Seminar 5? It's on the structure of the unconscious. It's an incredible, very accessible articulation of Lacan's revision of Oedipus complex into this 3-step process. So I want to understand these 3 steps of Oedipus, and we'll go from there. So for Lacan, the Oedipus complex has to do with what he calls the ruin of the imaginary itself. What this means is that the imaginary in itself is an incestuous and conflictual relation that is doomed to conflict and ruin. So what occurs at the Oedipal moment, and he uses the word moment and not stage, which I found interesting, is a change in the child's relationship to language. This is the first. The child in the Oedipal stage refers to itself as an I. This is an indication that some movement has taken place. Whereas the pre-Oedipal child, speech is largely mimicry, it's largely repetition, and so on. The moment that the desire becomes human is also that in which the child is born into language. This is what Lacan says in the Acreeds. So, what Oedipus is about in general is about an identification with an ego ideal of the father that happens at the 3rd moment of it, that is constitutive of the primary subjective individuation. So it's about becoming an individual. Now, as it pertains to the father, what I want to track is the father's role throughout the 3 stages of Oedipus. The first moment of the father is the superego laying down its authority, which happens in the imaginary. And this is often through the voice of the father. Here in this stage, the superego has an independence from the conscious ego, but is still intimate with the unconscious id. Now, for the neurotic, what we have is a delay. So the 3 stages I'm going to articulate are usually delayed in some way, sometimes dramatically and sometimes not so. For the psychotic and for perversion, what you have is neither goes through the Oedipus formation effectively, but for different reasons. In perversion, the child will identify with the phallus of the mother, with the beyond of the mother's desires where they identify, which is why Lacan says the first stage is perversion. Perversion, he says, is the primary state. This is something that was radically different than the object relations theorists of his time. In Seminar 4 and 5, what's happening is a major push against many of the core ideas of object relations. One of the key things is that he argues that the father, the function of the father, is not an environmental function. And he got this from Little Hans. In the case study of Little Hans, what you have is a father who was absolutely, perhaps we could say, the most modern, the most enlightened. He was the one who brought Little Hans to therapy. But it was actually the monstrous desire of the mother. The mother was almost the totalitarian father figure for Little Hans. But those are largely environmental. That is not to say that the father function within the Oedipal imaginary dialectic is necessarily different. So this is an important point that he says. And the other important thing that he says is that the father function, he says is in Seminar 5, what does it have to do with but metaphor? Metaphor is the key idea. And what this means is that the father is a signifier substituted for another signifier. Okay? The first signifier that the father substitutes is, of course, the maternal signifier. S in the place of S. Comes from the mother who is already linked to a sort of mysterious signified. The father comes in the place of that. The signifier of the father ensures in this first stage that the phallus remains within the imaginary. The father is that figure who mediates eventually. So let me take a step back. Let me go through so we're clear on the 3 stages. So the first
Daniel,
moment.
Can I ask you a quick question before you continue?
Yeah.
When you say the maternal signifier, that the signifier of the father metaphorizes, you mean what exactly?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're saying this mysteriously linked and so on, do you mean the desire of the mother? Because that is, I think, that's what I understood at least when I was going through your outline and when I was going back to the texts. The metaphor of the name of the father is when the father comes to metaphorize the desire of the mother, hence gives access for to structure, should we say, to neurosis for the child.
That's
it's
correct.
Not any mysterious signifier, right? It's a desire of the mother.
Well, in
it's
the
where
first,
the is placed precisely in its complex.
Yeah. So what I want to do is refer to these three moments. In the first moment, it has to do with what Lacan calls the primitive phallic stage. So in the first moment, the primacy of the phallus for the first time for the child is established by the existence of a signifier which is from the father. That signifier is the representation, so to speak, of the maternal signifier. Right? So that is the first moment that the child has some relationship to symbolization, but it's a symbolization that is not necessarily of the law, but it's just the sort of initial, mysterious, signified of the mother's desire. Okay? In the second stage, the father intervenes in an imaginary way. In the third stage, he intervenes more, I guess you could say, empirically. But in the second stage, he intervenes to deprive the mother. And what comes back to the child here is simply the law of the father, insofar as it is conceived as depriving the child of the mother's desire. So for the first time, the father becomes a supporter of the law of the signifier in the second stage. Okay? So hopefully you've followed me so far. And hopefully that answers your question. The third stage, and we're going to get back to how in psychosis for President Schreber, maybe we could say the second stage was where he remained, if not in the first stage. Okay, so we'll get to there in a moment.
So the second phase, he supports the law of the signifier?
In the second stage, the father intervenes within the imaginary, which is largely what Lacan calls primitive phallic stage, to deprive the mother. What comes back to the child here is the first indication of the law of the father.
In the second stage, you talk
Yes.
about kind of the norm.
Yes. And
The
so
father
we
says-
start with aggressiveness.
Not the norm, but the norm for the second stage, right?
We get the introduction of the nom, of the name, here in the second stage. The third stage is what is dependent on whether the child will get out of it, and this is the sort of transitionary stage, if you will. Third moment, the father can give the mother what she desires. This is why a crucial quote that Lacan's make is, a father is entitled to respect and love only if he makes a woman the cause of his desire. So a father is entitled to respect. Another way of saying that is if he can fulfill the paternal metaphor effectively. If he can metaphorize the mother's desire, both, what I understand, is both to the child and to the mother. I think that there's a three-way relationship, which under section 3 you'll see this, which I get from seminar 5, this graph shows that quite nicely.
What is the father, and why is the father entitled to respect if he can?
If he can make the woman the cause of his desire. And I think another way of saying that is if he can effectively metaphorize the mother's desire. So,
So Daniel, that metaphor is, he's not metaphorizing the mother's desire. He is proposing himself as an object of desire for that mother. Hence, the object is metaphorized. So it appears one signifier in place of the other.
that's true.
Okay,
That's true.
so at the beginning, the child is positioned as the phallus of the mother,
Yes.
where then is the object of this desire, this omnipotent stage that you are speaking of,
Yeah.
and then the child is deprived of of the jouissance with the mother,
Yes.
and vice versa, two-way deal, as you were explaining.
Mm-hmm.
But he becomes the object of desire for that mother again.
Yes. And at
Yeah.
the third stage, the father has the phallus. The child either has the choice of recognizing it or not. This is why for Lacan, for women, often it is something that they do not have to recognize that the father is in possession of the phallus. And this is also the point of ego ideal, which is something that is, hugely important both for men and for women in terms of getting out of this three-way process. This is also the point of virility. This is the point of generalization. This is the point where fear of castration is no longer. The point of fear of castration for Freud was, I think Lacan criticized a very literal reading, and as we know, Lacan took fear of castration and perhaps put it more within an imaginary conception, largely again through a reading of Little Hans and the metaphor of the horse. I don't have time to get into that. Seminar 5 illustrates it in an excellent sense. Okay, so those are the three stages. I think there may be some questions that remain. What I would like to do right now is do a quick reading of Seminar 3 for Schreber, so that we can understand how Schreber relates to Name of the Father. Why do I say that? Because the foreclosure of the primordial signifier for Schreber was the first time in which Lacan introduces, in a very rigorous way, Name of the Father. It came before that, actually, in his essay on criminology, but in Seminar 3 on psychosis, you really get a full picture. So, first and foremost, Lacan shows that the psychotic does not go through Oedipus, because the psychotic is not initiated into the play of signifiers. So, in this sense, I would say the psychotic is not even at level 2, if you like. This is, as we all know, this is why the psychotic is actually inhabited by language. This is also the reason why I think it's quite interesting from an axiomatic point of view, theory of subjectivity. Lacan would argue that we are all sort of at a point of perversion and psychosis from the origin, and then we move out of it through Oedipus. So what was Schreber's breakdown? Schreber had a breakdown, Lacan argues, over the primordial signifier of procreation. Procreation having to do with his failure to produce a child. This has also been studied from many different angles after Lacan. It also has to, his psychotic break also has to do with the assumption of symbolic authority upon being designated judge of judges. He had reached the highest institutional point of recognition within, I believe, within the whole country. I mean, it was a very prestigious position.
He was a judge of the Supreme Court.
Right.
No. He was the judge of the second highest. He was the head of the second highest court under Bismarck. Yeah.
Under Bismarck.
Yeah.
Okay, so, one of the things you find here is that Schreber is very important for many reasons. One, Schreber himself is incredibly intelligent. This is significantly the first case that Freud took seriously without it actually being a case of psychoanalytic exchange. It's purely based on his memoirs. What Lacan realized in reading the memoir very closely was that in all of the key terms that Schreber put forward, soul murder, voluptuousness, blessedness, all of these signifiers were what was foreclosed was this idea of what it means to be a father. And he discovers this signifier, the most elusive one, you could say. And the father is actually only mentioned once in the entire memoir. But it's interesting that the point that it's mentioned is in I guess you could say, an early manual on gymnastics, which had to do with, according to Lacan, the idea of, for the first time, realizing sexual relations, and for the first time realizing this idea of procreation. The groundbreaking idea of Lacan in his interpretation of Schreber compared to object relations theorists is the centrality of the father for Schreber's experience. The idea that Schreber could not integrate was this idea of being a father. It is, for Freud, the issue with Schreber, as you guys may know, has to do with the loss of the phallic object. Lacan responds to saying, while it's true that the phallic object is lost, and that Schreber wanted to imitate becoming a mother so that he could have a desire equal to the mother. But Lacan argues that we know the father never gives the phallus in the Oedipal dialectic. Lacan points out that the phallus must always be metaphorized. So there is a nice point of difference between the two on that point. And another interesting point to note is the way in which the phallus itself, for which he uses the metaphor of rainbow. A phallus is something that can never be located within the field of signifier relations as a that's it, right? So similar to a rainbow going across the sky, it's always in flux, it's always in movement, it can never be pinned down. And this is where you get the important point of the quilting point that Lacan develops towards the latter part of Seminar 3. So this is Schreber. Now, what we find with Schreber is similar to what we find, with the German poet Hölderlin. And the text by Jean Laplanche, Hölderlin and the Question of the Father, has been very interesting. I've written a book review on it, and I just wanted to briefly introduce how Laplanche performs a very, very interesting reading of the psychosis that set in with Hölderlin. Now, just to note, Laplanche is not a sort of highly rigid Lacanian, but he pulls from a number of different modalities of theory and so on. Yes?
Dan, before you jumped onto Hölderlin and Laplanche, can I ask you a quick question on,
Yes.
on Schreber's?
Yes.
My understanding is that the problem with Schreber was not necessarily not understanding how a father acts or what a father metaphorizes or what it means. My understanding was that the problem is precisely the phallic signifier in as much as it is the signifier of desire. This is why it is opaque.
Yes.
And the problem with that signifier is that when it is transmitted normally, let's say when the metaphor does work
Yeah.
and is effective, what it allows is the position allows us to sexuation. So allows us to be
Yes.
positioned within language as a man or a woman. Not how to be a father, but how to be a man. So the problem with Schreber and what the work of the delirium allows him to get is a different sexual position, the wife of God or the woman of God, right? So the problem with Schreber is not so much when he had kids, it's when it was the unchain of the psychosis. It happens at its most critical degree when he is given this appointment at the court in Dresde.
Yeah, but Lacan doesn't talk about that. This is, he really, in the seminar, I would argue that the break, the psychotic break itself, is not necessarily understood at that precise moment, but actually the primordial signifier itself of procreation, as he talks about towards the latter part of the seminar, really becomes isolated and really becomes this sort of central. Now, your first point, I definitely agree with you in this notion of the phallus and so on, but I don't know that Lacan would argue that it is this attainment of the title itself that led to the collapse.
Well, the collapse is when it's after he's got this thought of how nice would it be to be a woman at the time of sex.
Yeah.
So it's again the sexual position in language would unchain the psychosis.
Yes.
It's not necessarily tied to and Lacan comes back to this many times, not only in Seminar 3 but in many other seminars. He comes back to this in as much as it is the works of the psychosis and the work of the delirium that he is able to establish with Fleischig.
Yeah.
allows him to actually find a different position, delirious. So psychotic in as much as it is not one among others. That is what Oedipus does when it works.
Yeah.
It turns it into one more among others. Psychosis has a particular position when it comes to sexuation.
Yeah.
And that is what Schreber achieves.
Mm-hmm.
That is what Schreber achieves by way of the delirium and by way of writing the memoirs.
That's very
In
helpful.
fact, he's so effective that he actually convinces them all and he gets out of the asylum where he was in.
Yeah, 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 that's helpful. The reason that I wanted to bring up Schreber is twofold. One, name of the father is introduced in the most rigorous way from this position, and I wanted to pinpoint the importance, which spans sort of all psychotic breaks, to this signifier of the father. And so if I could, for the purpose of time, and thank you for the comment, move to Holderlin and just say a few brief things, because I still have some other things I want to go over. So Holderlin fell into a depression upon having a two-way relationship to two mentors of his, both of which fulfilled different functions of the father. On one hand, you had the father that Laplanche argued represented and constituted the law, and this was the poet Fichte. And then on the other hand, you had Schiller, and it's actually quite interesting in the history of the Sturm und Drang German Romantic poets and philosophers right around the French Revolution. There's this very important concept of Bildung, which is this sort of idea of the self-development of the subject, which is not quite Oedipalized, but is a sort of romantic theory of becoming a man. And so Holderlin's first psychotic break occurred when he was mentoring a young boy, in the projections that he put onto the young boy that were indicating for Laplanche that he was showing a huge amount of imaginary aggression onto the child. The major point at which he really falls into, some argue with psychosis, others don't. It's very politicized because many people don't want to take the work that he produced and put it into a clinical case. It feels a little too scientific for such a wonderful poet, and much of his psychosis was absolutely linked to much of the wonderful visions that he would create. Nonetheless, the two fathers, Schiller was, I guess you could say, the name of the father. Schiller was that figure that was put in the place that Laplanche calls the empty center. The empty center, which is quite interesting. It's a lack of a center. It's filled over at times through imaginary relations, through schizophrenic outbursts, but it has a dual relation. There's a good father and there's a bad father. This eccentric center was never filled over by the symbolization that the name of the father is able to do. So the name of the father failed. The invention of a new desire that he wanted Schiller to provide to him, and by just background, Schiller was, I guess you could say, the most accomplished poet and was somebody that he had elevated on a very high level. Fichte was a very science-based, rational philosopher. He constituted the law. Now, the very interesting point is that Holderlin leaves and retreats to live with his mother for a long time. While he is there, he ends up filling this eccentric center with the mother, and which is why in the Hyperion, one of his famous pieces, the figure of Diotima in the Hyperion would be used to cover over that. So he falls into maternal desire in such a way that the metaphor is no longer possible except through literature and through the invention of these myths. So that's a very interesting, if anything, recommendation to read that text. I want to move now to, how are we doing on time, by the way?
This is a very rich interpretation. I read the same stuff, and if I recall, one of the breakdown was when Schiller, who protected Hölderlin and got his things published.
Paid for his, yeah,
And got
absolutely.
it published.
Yeah.
And then Hölderlin had the fantasy of starting a new journal,
Mm.
which he hoped Schiller would
Mm.
finance,
Mm.
and Schiller.
Mhm.
And so a maternal figure in the imagination of Hölderlin showed a paternal
Mm.
limit.
Mhm.
And that was
Mhm.
one of the possible explanations.
Yeah,
of his
absolutely.
rebellion.
And also the father of the law, embodied by Fichte, also collapsed. So, and this is why he fell into a series of aggressive outbursts, of schizophrenic delusions, and so on. What saves him is retreating to live with his mother, which incidentally some people argue was where he produced some of his best work. So anyways, thank you for that. I want to talk about totem and taboo. You saw the section on it. Lacan does something in Seminar 17 that is quite radical when it comes to Oedipus and totem and taboo and so on. In Seminar 17, on the other side of psychoanalysis, Lacan demonstrates how the concept of name of the father is what links the Oedipus complex to the myth of totem and taboo. He says that the myth of totem and taboo, which let us go through it very quickly. The first point is brotherhood is founded on a segregation. It's founded on a radical separateness. The first point is what? You have this myth that is something that is a sort of meta myth, so to speak. It's a myth that is an accounting for the development of culture, for the development of the social bond, for a great many things, which is you have a situation which is sort of an imagined situation of a father who desires the jouissance be in his possession alone. The sons revolt against the father and they murder him. Upon that, the father moves to the second stage as the symbolic law of the society. The memory of the act is what cements the social bond. This is what Lacan says. The myth shows us two important things, he says in Seminar 17. The father of what's called the primal horde shows that brotherhood is founded on segregation, and that it's through murdering the father that Oedipus finds free access to Jocasta. So this is a very important first originary moment of the myth. Now, this is also the seminar where Lacan says that the Oedipus complex is purely a figment of Freud's dream, prior to the writing of Interpretation of Dreams. He says the Oedipus myth shows that the father's murder is the condition not only of access of the sons to jouissance, but the condition of jouissance itself. The important point here is that Freud, and this is the important point, interesting point. Freud argued that the religious myth, through his invention of this, the idea of religion at the time of his writing, was therefore in decline. That the myth itself and the idea of a decline in paternal authority, which is something that's emblematic of modernity more generally, means therefore that religion can be so-called brushed aside. Lacan argued the opposite in Seminar 17. He argues the opposite, as he usually does. And let's understand why he argues the opposite. Despite the fact he argues the discovery of shifting the father's authority in modernity leads to atheism, Lacan says as soon as the father enters the field of the symbolic, he is castrated. Oedipus is not merely castrated, it is the price that he pays. He goes blind and so on. It's not that Oedipus merely becomes castrated, but Oedipus becomes castration itself. What it means is that he has to pay his due for being chosen as master. And Lacan actually, this is where we talk about master's discourse heavily in Seminar 17. This means that what proceeds from castration is the very idea of being a progenitor, of having a line, of having a family, a familial generation to follow. For Freud, the father's murder can be understood at the level of a wish for Freud's father's death not to take place. Freud wished to be guilty for his father's death, that's the point, and this is where the interpretation of dreams comes from, he says. So in the second stage, we have the dead father. The father is now dead, which, of course, in Totem and Taboo has also to do with the prohibition of incest. This is sort of an elusive thing that Lacan sort of throws off to the side.
No minor detail, though.
It's a very significant point. It's a very significant
like
point.
This structure or not structure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is why Lacan calls the father in the first stage, what's the real father, this is the structural operator. The real father is the agent of castration, and it can only be defined, so Lacan defines castration as the introduction of a signifier into a sexual relation. Castration is what determines the father as the impossible real, is another way to say that. Okay, now I want to introduce some of my own research on post-Lacanian thought having to do with this three-part Oedipal dialectic and also this totem and taboo thing. Okay, so, you guys probably have come across some of this research on the late Lacan having to do with this notion that the disavowal of the necessary function of the father, this idea that we can get around the father function, that it's no longer necessary. Well, what is that caused from? It has to do with an idea of the blurring of the lines between the imaginary and the symbolic fathers, between oppression and repression. This has led to a problem with being able to recognize limits of desire, being able to recognize lack, and being able to have boundaries of desire. This is a postmodern problem. Just as early modernity and the Protestant ethic suffered from neurotic forms of inhibition and avowals of the law of the imaginary father, the postmodern condition of consumer society, of late capitalism, might even say of university discourse, suffers from the disavowal of the symbolic father and the avowals of the desires of the imaginary mother. So what we see is a shift in postmodern culture towards this pre-Oedipal. It's a shift to pre-Oedipal conditions. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's a shift to where the law of the father is now often subsumed within the imaginary of the mother. So what I'm proposing to you is a slight revision of these three steps from Totem and Taboo. So we have, and this actually may not contradict Lacan's revision of Freud's from Totem and Taboo. Stage one, I've called the stage of the real, inhabited by aggressiveness. Now aggression, as we know, is usually inhabited within the imaginary stage. This is where the father of the horde is murdered because he refuses to share the true sons, as we talked about. Stage two is the establishment of society, is the submission to the law of the father. It is also sublimation of the dead father. That's what's taking place there. The dead father who was assassinated returns to guard. Now, this is also a very interesting indication at this stage too. We see the rise of fundamentalism. We see the rise of cultures wanting to bring back the primordial father. In Islam, a very interesting thing, unlike Christianity, the progenitor relation is not based on the father. There's a beautiful Lacanian psychoanalyst named Fethi Ben Slamam who writes on name of the father within the Islamic tradition. And one of the things he points out is how the Prophet Muhammad, in the 99 names of God, not one of them is the name of the father. Not one of them. But the line actually comes off of the mother. So it's perhaps a different, completely different thing in terms of analyzing.
But that's functions, Daniel. The function of the father, it doesn't mean that it needs to be a man fulfilling.
No, that's true.
It's a function. So it can, a mother,
that's
like
true.
in Islam, can very well, in a matriarchal culture like Islam or like American Indians,
can still have the Oedipal
name
process, the
through
name of the
women,
father. Yeah.
It's still the name of the father.
You're right. You're right about that. But my point is slightly different, which is that it actually leads to according to Ben Slama, different relations of perversion. Okay? So there are differences in the symptomatic differences that take place as a result of this, which I don't have the time to get into. I don't.
Perversion, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So, anyways, okay, so the third stage, thank you for that intervention, that was very helpful. In the third stage, the son becomes initiated. Remember, we should always remember that the myth of the father that Freud talked about ends in love. The third stage of Oedipus is love. Ego ideal for Freud has to do with love, and it is a certain, and you see this in Civilization and its Discontents, it is a certain basis of the social bond that can be sort of a guard against symptomatic formations. The third stage is when you have a situation where you have a kind of reconciliation. Now, in postmodern culture, you have a reversal. And the reversal has been summarized very well, that no longer, that the father in today's times tends to be the one who envies the son's jouissance. Whereas in Lacan's time, it was the reverse. This is very interesting. The notion being that we have often a non-foundational aggressiveness that finds itself doomed to death drive repetition, that lacks the capacity for initiation with a symbolic father, which is, in other words, this second father, this father of the symbolic, is unable to intervene to facilitate an initiation. This is a great example for gang culture, for example. There's no initiation with the father that's able to be had in gang culture. This is also why in today's times, often for father-to-son relations that are strained in Oedipal formations, you have a reconciliation that can only take place through the infantilization of the father. Now, this is also why in Lacan's reading, in an unpublished seminar, he cites Claudel's play, the three plays by Claudel. You know the playwright, Claudel. The humiliation of the father is the third act of this play, where you have something like, I don't have the time to get into it, but you have something like a new version of Antigone as it pertains to the Oedipal formation. I can only recommend books on this subject. I've written about it myself, but it's fabulous. Any questions at this point? I know I'm giving you guys a lot, but if there's anything that was unclear or any comments that you'd like to make, I still have one final thing I want to say. I don't know how we're doing on time.
Fine, go
We're
ahead.
fine on time? I want to say a few things about clinical applications of this idea of name of the father. End of analysis, Lacan frequently says, at the end of analysis, I am this A, beyond the name of the father. Which is very interesting because it's something like I guess you could say the assumption of the name. Like, in other words, why is the Wolfman and the Ratman given new names? It's their name of A, it's their name of jouissance, in other words. So it's a very interesting notion of end of analysis and name of the father, that there is a capacity to define the jouissance of the subject outside of name of the father.
Is outside of or beyond?
Beyond. The other point I want to make is this transition from name to names. One easy way to understand the difference what I'm trying to make between the name of the father versus the names plural is simply that, to the point that Gabby said, which is the pluralization of the father function is such that, and Lacan has a beautiful quote in an unpublished seminar on Oedipus. He says that, what is the main lesson of Oedipus? It is that Oedipus was an orphan, and he had to invent the father function for himself. And then he says, that is our lot. We must also invent the father. So for a young boy, a example might be that the father function let's say, the third stage of Oedipus, which, to summarize, has to do with the invention of a new jouissance, might not come from the biological father. Maybe he goes to college, he meets a musician, and somehow this friend fulfills the function of the father, enables him to invent something for himself. So the work of the analyst is to translate this jouissance into words. The name of the father thus has to do with directing the subject towards an ideal. The analyst, on the other hand, must, Lacan says, come in the way of the object that is not idealized. He says, beyond the one who speaks in the other's discourse, what is there that assumes the other's voice each time is the question of the father. So this pluralized names of the father is always what says yes to the joining together of a signifier with jouissance. It is the other that validates this invention. So we can understand the plural function in the sense in which the ego ideal is established, sure, but the Lacanian name of the father establishes the law but also transgresses it. The paternal function transgresses the law where it is necessary to do so. Thus, the name of the father is what enables the subject to invent a new jouissance. So, in the late Lacan, on the symptome, Seminar 23, we find a definitive break with this idea of name of the father. It takes a secondary relation to desire of the mother. The father is the one now who names. The father is thus, the name of the father is thus reversed. The father that names. This father gives names a function. I don't have time to get into it. It's a very complex seminar. The idea has again to do, if we go back to Frege's logic, this idea, the difference between a proper name and a common noun. The father as name is what nominates a thing that already exists. This is what is related to the fourth ring in the Borromean chain, that is the symptome. The symptome and the name of the father are in essence conceptually the same thing. Now the father as name or symptome is no longer the metaphor of the paternal, but is what Lacan calls a suppletion. A suppletion is basically a new signifier that doesn't replace but attaches to an existing signifier. I think I'd like to end on this quote, which is very interesting for our discussion, which is psychoanalysis with its success demonstrates that one can also get rid of the name of the father. One can get rid of it, i.e. ignore it, on condition that you make use of it. So, thank you.
But in that seminar, there is nevertheless a very interesting suggestion. That is, instead of the name of the father, if the mother can, and it's in French, nommer à, which is translated pointing to. If the mother is capable of looking at the child and pointing to things that the child can do well, which is then an invitation of making a career of it. You are good in running, maybe an athlete. You are good in mathematics, maybe that. But that thus several of the functions that are attributed to the paternal function, namely invite the child to create an ideal, but on the basis of his capabilities, not on the basis of an imaginary fusion.
That's helpful. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Daniel. The presentation was packed. There's a lot to cover there.
Thank you.
I had a quick question, and sorry about the background noise. That this thing that you say at the end, you know, that at the end that what the analyst does is put words to that jouissance. What the analyst does
not
is
exactly.
desire.
Yeah.
Which desire and jouissance are very different things.
Sure.
Although the name of the father, and I would say the metaphor,
Yeah.
the consequences of the structure, do bring both to bear.
Yeah.
I think that the case with Joyce, the fourth knot around the fourth ring in the Borromean knot, is what has been interpreted by many as psychical reality. So what allows Joyce to be able to constitute its own name, which is nonetheless an Ulysses, which is that's what is at stake in 24. It's by way of the psychical reality that we come into the fourth knot. And also, that quote that you bring at the very end is enlightening, in as much as if you need, in order to be beyond or go beyond of the father, like for example, when Freud went and saw the Orvieto and all of this, it's interpreted as the end of analysis of Freud. When that is possible, it's only possible on condition of, as you said, making use of it. So if it is still by making use of it, it's not really all that beyond. It is just a use of it that allows you your own name in the use. That is the name of jouissance. The name of the jouissance that one gets at the end of analysis. And it is quite, I'm actually surprised that you mentioned this. Not many academics get into the end of analysis. So I am, it's courageous on your end. I think that's great.
Thank you.
But you're welcome. But I mean, the beyond, if you're making use of it, there is still a condiment there, should we say, of some sort of acknowledging the father. In use you make of it.
Right.
Precisely.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's very helpful. Yeah, I'm very interested in subjectivization in Lacan and Lacan's contemporary interpreters, because much of the theory of the subject in contemporary French philosophy, one of the primary nodes of Lacan's influence on it is end of analysis. And you could say that there is a sort of interesting philosophical error that is made in the presumption that you can take the processes of end of analysis, which are very clinical and very structured on analyst-end to analyst relations, and
linked
somehow...
to experience of being on the couch.
Oh, exactly. No, but you can somehow enlarge them to larger societal applications. Like, in other words, we can see other processes almost in the same framework, but it's a different kind of subjectivization. So I'm very interested in that. Very interested. So thank you for your comments, and I would recommend reading Claudel. I believe it is on transference. It is a seminar on transference right after the ethics, where he goes into this beautiful interpretation of Claudel's 3 plays, where you have this, I guess you could say, a postmodern confrontation. See, the play is basically about the kidnapping of the Pope. And you have a young woman who is anybody familiar with the play?
Yeah.
Yeah?
So,
it's an incredible example of modern shift in paternal authority. And the tragedy that ensues because of that shift, so to speak. And the writer, Claudel, is a very conservative Catholic in French society at the time, and but he's a brilliant playwright. And so anyways, I don't know if you wanted to say.
So there is there an officer who executes the parents, and the 2 children sit in front and are spilled with the blood of the parents. And then that officer has custody of the Pope, and he falls in love with the girl. And the girl, of course, not. And
the girl, of course,
the girl refuses. However, the officer says if you marry me, I will not kill the Pope. Go to your confessor to tell that. And the confessor advises her to marry that officer, and the rest of the play is that her desire dies.
That was a biased confessor, right?
Well, the confessor, presume, I don't know exactly how high he was. If it would be a lowly confessor, he might. But if he was a high functioner that had some responsibility for the Pope, so that I do not remember very well.
I mean, it's just very. That part is so interesting because the confessor, instead of absolving the penitent, he commits a sin. It's the roles are reversed.
So, one of the things I've been doing a lot of research on is Hollywood depictions of paternal authority in sort of in new Hollywood films, and you find a lot of this three-part dialectic from totem and taboo still playing itself out. But one of the fantasies that you see often in teen drama films is this this idea that the child can somehow, which again goes back to this idea of much of postmodern culture, at least structurally, is in a pre-Oedipal position.